If you've ever thought to yourself, I'd rather just read about this than actually do it, you're not alone. The Enneagram 5 newsletter exists to help you move from knowing to experiencing. Every Saturday, you'll get insights designed to help fives grow without overwhelm. Sign up for free today at enneagram5.com/newsletter or visit the link in the description. Now on to the show. The following is an episode of Afterthoughts, which is the podcast we host inside of our private community where we debrief the episodes that we publish kind of in real time. This conversation is very unstructured and it's definitely unedited, but Cody and I had such a great time recording this one that we wanted to release it to the wider audience. So enjoy this look into the behind the scenes, and if you like this episode, consider joining the community so you can listen to more of these. All right, on to the show. Well, live to us.
Yeah.
Welcome to Afterthoughts.
Hello, everybody.
This is the intuition edition.
Yeah. Yes, it is.
So I listened through the episode today.
Mm-hmm.
This is the night before it comes out.
Yeah.
And I sounded about as batshit crazy as I thought I would, which was good. I was on par.
Yeah, I have thoughts. I listened to it recently also because the way that we're doing it with the new format, you know, we ask for the responses, we do it. So it's like I edit the final edit gets done a lot sooner it's a lot closer to the release day. So I've listened to this episode too.
Nice. We can have a real conversation about it.
Yeah. You know, sometimes though, I think it works out that I haven't listened to it because then it's like new thoughts about that topic instead of just remembering what we talked about before. But I did come to an interesting realization because of this episode. I've never been able to like put it into words, the differences between you and I in like certain ways that we think about things, but I now understand it. Like, cause I've been like kind of framing it in my mind for a while and thinking about like how differently we approach things. And intuition is actually a really great topic because of where you took this episode. This is a great topic to bring this up. So, I think that it's what's interesting about this conversation is how our wings play a part in this conversation for me. Because I was, you know, I think it was something you shared with me recently about the wings and how they kind of show up in our lives. And I don't think I responded to it, but I was like, wow, that was really accurate. And then I just kind of moved on.
Right.
As
like
I do.
90% of the stuff that I send you. Yeah,
yeah, as I do. And I'm awful at texting back. And the more people in the group text, the worse I am at texting back.
Well, what's funny though, is like you respond way more often when Amy posts something than when I post something.
Really?
Yes.
Maybe it's because I never talk to her. That might be what it is. I never see her anymore. But anyway, I was thinking about this in terms of like, when I was listening to it, I was having fresh thoughts about intuition and then kind of like listening to our old conversation through that lens a little bit. And it kind of made me realize, because 5-wing 4s tend to be a lot more like lean into the mystical side of things and like more or mythical, whatever you want to say. I mean, I feel like it kind of leans into that. Whereas 5-wing 6 tends to be more like grounded in practicality and like what you can see in front of your face.
Yeah.
And that so perfectly represents how I was in Christianity. I never believed in speaking in tongues. Like I never believed in like all the stuff. And even the idea of believing in God seemed a ludicrous idea to me. Like the whole time I was a Christian. So some people might say I never was a Christian because of that. But I was definitely a doubter. And churches don't like doubters. But I was thinking about that, and even back then, because I my mind went back to the episode where we had our friends on, and we did the Friends of Fives episode.
Yes, which hasn't come out yet.
Oh, you're right. Well, it's a great. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
Well, here's a little sneak peek. There were things that were said. We talk about our growing up and stuff, right? Because your friend that's on that episode was with you since high school, and so and he got to see a version of you that to me makes sense because you were so like in the religious thing, right? Like you like really believed it. You were very like evangelical, or like, I don't know if we're more evangelical or Pentecostal. I don't really know. It's kind of charismatic either way.
It went from one end to the other because when I grew up in West Virginia, and like my dad, he grew up like backwoods Methodist, and then when he was 30, went to some rally in DC and came back like full blown Pentecostal, like charismatic Pentecostal, and started one of those kinds of churches. So that's what I actually grew up in.
Oh yeah, okay.
Initially.
Yeah. Okay.
And
that makes sense.
So that's my background. And then when I moved to Gallatin, where Brendan and I met, it was the first time we really went to a non-charismatic church. It was just like a independent Baptist church.
Interesting.
And we went there because, one, it was at the end of our street, so it was like 2 minutes away.
Sure.
And two, I had a crush on a girl who went there, and that's why I asked my parents to go try it.
Yeah, that tracks. That tracks. That's usually how that goes.
Yeah.
Well, it kind of makes sense then that you'd go off the deep end of batshit crazy, and I'm like trying to be the five, and like in my mind, the five in the room, right? Like, okay, but is any of this tested? Like, if you just making this up out of thin air? And when I got to that part of the conversation, it solidified it in my head, looking back on it and kind of reflecting like our differences in pretty much any conversation we ever have about anything is like, it tends to be like you're in the ethereal up here and I'm like down here on the ground.
You asked me that question a lot of like, who else says, who, like, where does this come from? Like, who else has said this,
Yeah.
And it feels like I tend to be more internally referenced versus externally referenced, because
what does that mean? What do you mean by that?
It wasn't always this way, but especially in the last few years, I have weighted my own individual experience and intuition much more heavily when it comes to trying to figure out what reality is.
Yeah.
And just because I feel like it, when you approach everything the way that we tend to with logic, there's a bit of self-deception in that, I think, because everything that you do is always through a lens of experience first, and you cannot view things absent of your life experiences. That's just not that's the way our brain works, is like it's a filter, and it takes all of our past experiences and it tries to take in new information and make predictions about that based off of everything that is known, to start to try to figure out things that are unknown. All right. And I think that when in the past, when I have discounted my own experience, my own intuition, I ended up getting really out of alignment, and then over time, and I think this is what I was trying to get to in this episode, was over time, as I've started to lean into it more and experiment and like actually run little experiments, and the model that I tried to describe in this was just a model that helps me sort of conceptualize the mechanics of it, which then, if I can conceptualize the mechanics of it, then I can figure out how to gamify it, right? And which lets me run experiments. And in doing so, then I can validate or invalidate hypotheses, and I can figure out like to what degree I can, like, is there any accuracy in that? And then that over time increases my confidence in my own experience and my own intuition. And that's what I've been doing for the last few years. And that's why, like, to the outside, if you don't understand, like, that's my process, and because we haven't really talked about this much.
Yeah.
And like looking out or looking in, it seems like I am kind of like off in the ethereal. But there's actually a pretty rigorous, like almost scientific process in a lot of it, but I just don't talk about it really.
Yeah.
Because I don't even recognize that I'm doing it half the time until I like stop and I'm like, oh yes, this is what I'm doing. I remember how we got off on that tangent. What were you going to say?
Well, I mean, no, it's not really a tangent. It is kind of what we're talking about. I feel like, yeah, I mean, I think,
internally reference versus externally reference. That's why we got off on that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and it's like, it's like science is based on this idea of peer review and being able to prove or disprove things. I guess mostly disproving is the way I understand it. At least it's how my brother described it. And so for me, it's like, an example is like somebody's worldview can be insanely close-minded if they just base all experience on their experience, which I would assume would be internally referenced in that context, right? Internal reference, is that how you're defining it?
It depends on how that worldview was created. So if like you have a worldview that was handed to you and that you never questioned and you never tested, then that's almost purely like externally referenced like worldview that you've adopted. It's all like, this goes back to our conspiracy theory episode, where basically the premise was that it matters much less like what you believe and it more like how you believe what you believe. And that's what I'm much more interested in, is like the how. And that's why I kind of made the case in that episode to believe more conspiracy theories, because the more that you do, the more that it gets you comfortable and kind of like takes away the power of that fear of being seen as incompetent, which is actually the thing that keeps you stuck, that keeps you from figuring out, getting closer to truth.
Okay. But I mean, saying like, you're going to have to explain the difference between how and what, because like, sounds like semantics to me. Because like, you believe what you're going to believe, and the how of it seems like secondary to the what. Because if the what is really dangerous belief, then the how doesn't matter to me. So like that's what it sounds like to me.
Right. Okay. So I think that when it comes to I'm trying to think about how to explain this best. Like I can have a belief that all bald people are evil. Right? And there could be different ways. There are different ways to kind of come to that belief. All right. One is I grew up having this taught as a dogmatic belief,
right,
that I never questioned. And because that when you're, up until you're like 7 or 8 years old, like you cognitively, you just accept new information that comes in, and that forms your belief system. You don't really have the ability to really question things in the way that you can as your brain develops in later ages.
Right.
And so that's why so much of who we are is formed in those first 7 years.
Yeah.
And so there's in that, then if you haven't questioned it, then you are unaware of all of the ways that it can affect your decision making. You're unaware, like, and it becomes this thing that is part of your identity that you feel like you have to protect. Right. Now, if I somehow went through the process of interviewing a bunch of bald people and formed my, later in my life and came to the conclusion that bald people are evil through a course of doing 100 interviews or spending 100 hours with you, Cody, then, and like, that's something that I came to. It could be a belief that I have, but it's held differently, right? It's held not from a place of identity, but from more of a position that I've stepped into. but it's open to new information. And so I'm not going to be as dogmatic about it. I'm much less likely to do things like attack you for it because I'm still open to it. So this is what I'm saying. Like, it's the same belief, but it's how it was developed, and two, it's like how you hold that belief. And the point I was making in that episode was that the first one is a method for breaking that is like, if you grew up believing just one conspiracy theory, go start believing a bunch of other conspiracy theories, but actually do it in a way where you start to run into contradicting ones, right? And then that helps you go through that process of being okay with letting go of that identity, and not tying your beliefs to your identity.
Right.
And I guess that's kind of what I meant. Does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah. Like, if you're a flat earther, you should try to prove that the earth is round.
Yeah. And actually, like, I mean, that's a great example. Like, go both ways. Like, this is one of the things that you've probably heard me say before. Like, if you can't steel man the other side of the argument that you're holding, you don't actually have an opinion. You have talking points that you were handed. Right. Consciously or unconsciously. Yeah. And so anytime I am like, I find myself in that place where I'm like, okay, this is a strong opinion that I have, I do my best to try to steelman the other side of it. And then that at least helps me self-evaluate. Is this something that I started to believe as a result of just like propaganda that is unconscious? Sure. Or is it actually something that has legs to it, that when I try to steelman the other side of it, that it still holds. Right. And so I'm like constantly doing that more, like where I went through, I don't do that as much now, like in terms of spending a lot of cognitive processing on it, because I've gotten to a better place, like where I don't need to do that.
Because you quit your job and you have better things to do with your mind right now.
Well, that's part of it, but like a lot of the I've already gone through a metamorphosis, in like the 2021, 2022 frame, where I like my entire worldview was turned upside down for like the third or fourth time in my life. And in that I had to go through that process of like questioning everything all over again. Yeah. And so coming out on the other side, now I have a different worldview, and I came to that in a different way. Yeah. And so at least right now, I'm not doing a ton of that, because of that, and also because I'm doing things that are productive, like externally.
Right. Yeah. And it takes a lot of intuition to be able to sort through that, and we're back on topic. Yeah. But it does affect intuition. I was thinking about that in terms of, before we go too far, I just have to say, like, one of my favorite pastimes when I'm feeling like I need some type of vindication in the world, especially right now. There's nothing I love more than watching videos of people trying to run scientific experiments, proving flat Earth and then proving that it's round. It's one of my favorite videos. I love
that documentary on Netflix was pretty great.
I don't think I saw the documentary. The clips that I've watched on YouTube might have been from the documentary.
So good.
Anyway, all that to say, but I was listening to the, editing the responses and stuff, and it was interesting for me to also hear, like, just when people are talking, you can kind of hear kind of the background they're coming from, right? And you can hear the different kind of viewpoints, and hearing the wings. Just like when I was identifying our wings, it was easier for me to identify. But when a 5 talks about something as like intangible as intuition and trying to make sense of it, you can really hear the difference in perspective there. And I thought that was kind of nice, because it's very evenly represented in this episode.
I love all the responses that we've been getting.
Yeah, the last 2 episodes have been killer. Like, I mean, what was the first? Anxiety. The anxiety episode, some of those responses were like almost like tear jerking for me. I was like, man, these are like, I hope that we've played a part in all of you guys opening up even more as 5s, because I was really impressed.
Yeah, it's my favorite part of the episodes by far.
Yeah, it is me too. Yeah. And it's cool that I think because we get more of them, I can make them more of the episode, which I think we've had feedback. People have liked that and liked it having longer. For me, it was when we first started doing it, I felt like it was going to be like I was worried about it being too long, right? And like too much of a break from the regular conversation. But if it's longer, then it becomes more a part of the conversation, and it kind of does the opposite effect, which I like. It's cool.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I kind of going back to what I was saying, the reason why that this has been actually this whole episode was really interesting timing, because last week, and I shared a little bit about this in the community, but last week I was doing working with the author coach,
right?
And I wasn't going to say anything that I was writing another book manuscript, but I just felt like I had to share based off of what happened. But it's a small group, so there are three or four of us going through this process in a small group, like cohort, working with him, and he has this process that he takes you through, and in the beginning is like not writing at all; it's actually drawing, and it's trying to putting off the left brain and interfering for as long as possible in the process, and this approach that I took this time was so different than the last time I did this. The last time I did it, I already had formed, like I'd done a lot of mental processing, and analyzing, and I had formed a narrative in my head already. And so as I was drawing things, I was really just illustrating the structure I had already built in my head. And so I came into it with a preconceived notion of what it should be. And unsurprisingly, I wrote a 50,000 word manuscript, and it was garbage because it didn't make sense. It's like there was no good cohesive flow to it.
You're trying to make it something.
I was trying to make it something, but I didn't actually know what it needed to be.
Right.
Because I didn't do the work of that discovery.
Yeah.
I mean, I did to an extent, but I didn't get far enough with it because I didn't approach it the way that I approached it this time, of the reason, last time it was I had this narrative I had to get out of me, and that's why I did it. This time it was, I just went through a transformation, and I still haven't made sense of a lot of it, and I got invited to do this, and normally I would say no because I have so much other stuff going on, but intuitively I felt like, no, this is an opportunity that's arising at this time for a specific reason. This is something that you want to say yes to. And so I said yes to it. And I'm like, I don't even know what I would write a book about right now. It's this is the hard thing. And so I sat down and did this exercise, and I just let things come out.
Yeah.
Without trying to make sense of them.
Right.
In the moment. And what I drew on the paper, I'm like, I don't want to talk about half the stuff at this point.
Okay.
Just this isn't something that I would want to it feels so vulnerable for me to try to even go through a process of writing about some of this stuff because I haven't done that mental processing and got it to a point where it's it's through the filter where I can make sense of it, and I can come across looking like I know what I'm talking about and control it. Yeah. And one of the things that I had drawn on there was that illustration of what I kind of tried to describe in the episode, but have since fleshed it out more. And I drew it when you and I were hanging out with our friend the other night. I'd drawn it in his notebook, and it's basically where truth meets time. And it's trying to take that 2D representation to make it 3D, and what that process actually looks like. And so for whatever reason, that was what was coming out. So I drew that, I drew some other stuff, and I'm like, I really hope he doesn't ask me about this. And sure enough, he asked me about it, and I tried to explain it and all this stuff.
Was this in a group setting?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
And I'm like, I feel very vulnerable because I don't know why this is coming up. And he's like, well, that is actually a perfect signal for to press in and ask what is it about this that is significant for you?
Yeah, what's resonating right now?
What's resonating, and when was the first time in your life when this that you started feeling this way,
Mm,
and what are the things that held this back before, and just all this, and I'm starting to cry, like, damn it, Azul, like every time he makes me cry, because like there's something there, and I don't know what it is, and it scares the hell out of me, because I'm like, I don't want to do this in real time, in a group, and like, it feels very, very vulnerable. But it all had to do with this. There's just something about this concept, this model of time, and intuition that just keeps coming up for me. And I think a big part of that is that it played a major role in, over the last few years, me rediscovering myself. And that's a big part of the significance for me, is that because I started listening to my intuition, and I did it when the stakes were high, when like the whole world was trying to demonize me for the choices I was making. And I was like, I get it. But something's off here, and I need to trust myself. And it was really fucking hard, but I did it anyway. And then through that, I started to learn who I am, and went on this path of self-discovery that led to me healing trauma, and led to me, uncovering like that inner creator, and reconnecting with that part of myself that I thought had died. And so it's like it's a weird roundabout way to get there. Yeah. But as I was going through this, I'm realizing, that's why this stuff that's why I keep getting, like, I'm obsessed with these ideas. Yeah. It's what it's teaching me about myself, and the way that it's changing it's like expanding my model of reality in a way that also, for lack of a better word, like expands me spiritually, or like my consciousness level, to the point where I see things from a different perspective. And that's what I was trying to explain before, is like, when we say now and we think of it as a dot, it's a very small now. But if you think of it as because we're looking at it in 2D, right? And that's when I started trying to draw the gradient. But if you think about it not as a dot, but if you think about it in 3D as a sphere, right? And so what now is, it's like me, and now it's if it expands out in the horizontal, it's time. If it expands in the vertical, it's like truth. And that's or for lack of a better word, like my experience of like me. It's like, because that's the only thing that I can actually validate is my own experience. Like, all the rest of this could be a simulation, right? The only thing that I know of is like I'm experiencing something, right? That's the only thing that I can confirm. And so that's why intuition is so important, because if you convince yourself that you can't trust that, or you let others convince that you can't trust that, then that severely hampers your ability to discover who you are, and to step into your power. And that sounds really woo-woo, but like,
yes, King.
But I mean that in a very like real, tangible way, because I felt, for a long time in my life, I felt very powerless, and I felt very at the mercy of my circumstances. Sure. And over the last 10 years, but the last 2 or 3 years especially, I've been like taking the reins of my own life. And I would not have had the confidence to do that if I hadn't validated over and over that I can trust my intuition, even when the world and all logic in the moment is telling me that I'm wrong. Yeah. And then I end up being right. It all ends up working. Sure. And aligns. And that's actually like why I'm here right now, doing this full time right now, is because I listened to my intuition last fall, and changed jobs, and then got laid off.
Yeah.
but got laid off in a different way than I would have gotten laid off in my last job.
That's true, yeah.
In like a much
this opportunity.
much better situation, yeah. And it all comes back to actually one very specific decision where I had filled out like 93 applications.
Yeah.
And I'd even actually applied to the job through the proper application portal, and then didn't hear anything. And from any of those jobs, like it's the weirdest thing.
Yeah.
Because I know my resume is at least good enough to have a phone call conversation, right?
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
like a phone screen. But then the recruiter for this job because I'd sent him a connection request. He didn't accept it, but I was following him because of it. Mm-hmm. And he posted about the job again and posted this little graphic. And at the bottom, it said, apply through the website or send me an email here. I'm like, I had that like intuitive, that intuitive zap of like, you should email him. Mm-hmm. And then immediately my analytical brain was like, I'm not going to email him. I've already applied through the website. Like I'm just going to be, bugging him or like, it's just kind of right. And then I stopped and I started to scroll and then I was like, wait, hold on. That was my intuition. It's going to take me like a couple of minutes. I'm just going to do it. And so I sent him an email, attached my resume and said, hey, I applied through so-and-so, but I saw your post and here's like 3 bullet points on why I'm a perfect fit for this. Let me know if you're interested. And he responded within like 20 minutes. And we had an interview for the next day. And then like 2 days later, I was talking with the CEO of the company. Mm-hmm. And then like the next week I was doing the next interview and it was like fast tracked. It was like a 2-week process to get like from initial touch point all the way through. And it was like,
that's crazy. Yeah.
And if I hadn't listened to my intuition, that wouldn't have happened. Mm. And I would have been in a very different situation that would have been much, much less obvious to me that it was the universe saying, okay, now's the time to be a creator full time. And I'm not saying that it wouldn't have happened, but I wouldn't have learned sort of the same lessons that I had learned, not just this, but other things that I had learned in that process. Yeah. If I hadn't listened to my intuition on that and a few other things last fall. And so it's really interesting how that starts to play out when you're operating from this place. And again, one of my new favorite phrases is like, all models are wrong. Some models are useful. Right. And I'm not even saying that like the model that I'm trying to describe is reality. Yeah. It doesn't matter if it is or not, because it's a model that I'm using that is useful to me right now. Yeah. And it's helping me. If I wasn't using this model, I would miss these like little synchronicities. And it's because it's training my mind to be more aware of my present moment and the things around me and look for signals. And when I find them, then I start to recognize patterns. And it's really interesting where before I think the patterns were there, I just couldn't see them because I wasn't paying attention. But now that I'm paying more attention, I'm starting to see more, and really little weird things are happening. So,
like, what do you mean by patterns?
So, did I tell you the story about the shopping cart and the ice?
No, that sounds like a really great sermon title.
Oh yeah, I think I was going to tell this story. I don't remember when we actually recorded the intuition episode. It might have happened after that.
Yeah.
So I'd been cold plunging, and at this point, I bought a cold plunge to try at the house, and I wanted to go get ice for it. It was on like a Saturday.
Yeah.
And I had been kind of wrestling with a pretty significant life decision for a while. And this was one of those things where it's like, it's a big decision and my intuition is telling me one direction, but I really want to go the other direction because it will make my life so much more simple and easy and at least temporarily enjoyable.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I really wanted to figure out like how I can prove my intuition wrong. And I had all but like made the decision that I was going to go in the opposite direction. And then this Saturday morning, I woke up with like an ocular migraine.
Okay.
And it was like behind my left eye, felt like someone was stabbing me.
Yeah. Been there.
And it was awful. And I went in my office and did some self-hypnosis to try to like see if I could get like through relaxation or whatever, I could kind of alleviate some of this stuff. And I went into it with the intention of like, okay, rather than trying to fix it, I'm going to just let myself be curious and like, you know, observe and, you know, let myself feel it and just see what, you know, see if that helps me kind of move through it rather than.
Yeah. It's very Buddhist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I did that, and a very weird thing came from it, where as soon as I went into that state, I had this this intuitive it sounds so strange to say this out loud, this intuitive sense that myself from the future, or my higher self seeing the future, was trying to get my attention.
Okay.
And that it was very important that I listened to my intuition in this decision. And I wasn't even like, I didn't go into this process even thinking about that decision, but it all just kind of came to me of like, this pain is to try to get my attention so that I don't make this decision the wrong way. And I'm like, what the fuck? Like, that's just like I'm uncomfortable with this, right?
That's way out there.
I'm uncomfortable with this, but you know what? I said I'm going to be open, and I'm just like, okay, let's assume this is true for a little bit. All right. You know, let's roll with it. Let's see what happens. Okay. And I'm like, okay, well, then I will stay true to my intuition. I will not make this decision. I don't want to say what the decision is. I'll tell you off air.
Okay.
But I will, and then within, this, I think part of the reason why I'm so uncomfortable with this is because it sounds very similar to how I grew up religiously.
Yeah.
And I don't like that.
Yeah. Super mystical.
Yeah. But like, there's all this sort of like, religious dogma that was wrapped around it that I just don't subscribe to anymore. And so it's hard to have this conversation and talk about these things without that coming up for me internally. And this was true then as well when I was experiencing this. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to just practice listening to my intuition, and maybe that will help me feel more confident in trusting it in this big decision. And so, I did that, and then, like an hour went by, and it was shortly after the migraine started to alleviate. I'm like, okay, I want to try out this new cold plunge that I got. I'm gonna go get some ice for it. And there are two stores near my house. There's the Food City, and then there's Publix. And I had gotten ice from Food City before, so I knew what the price was. And so I'm trying to remember this now. This is okay. So I think what happened was I intuitively was going to go to, or I was just kind of like out of habit going to go to Food City first. And then I was like, I wonder what the price is of ice at Publix. And so I decided to go to Publix first. And in that, that That's what it was. It was I was I had this little intuitive sense of like, go to Publix. I didn't know why. I'm like, I'm just gonna be, I'm gonna see what the price of the ice is.
Yeah.
So I go to Publix, and I'm taking way too long to tell the story, I feel like. And then I start to go in, and I notice, but at the entrance, kind of over off to the side, there's a guy in a wheelchair. He's like a youngish guy. He's probably like in his 30s. Yeah. He has a dog, and he is like creating, like drawing and painting watercolors for money. Yeah. And I had this intuitive sense of like, I need to go talk to him, but I didn't want to do that. Yeah. So I just went in the store, right? Mm-hmm. And I went and checked the ice, and it was like twice as expensive at Publix, of course. And so then I came back out and started walking to the car, and then it was like, go talk to him. I'm like, damn it. And so I went and talked, and all this too is like very like similar to like feeling like you're hearing the Holy Spirit talk. Sure. Like, this is another reason why this is so hard.
Well, I've always said, even when I was in Christianity, I said that, God speaking to you might just be your own intuition. Yeah. I've always considered that. Like, it's just our intuition. Anyway, go on. I'll say this.
Yeah. So so I go talk to him, and the whole time too, it's like I'm trying to make sense of it.
Yeah.
So I'm looking for like, what profound revelation am I going to get from all this stuff?
Yeah.
And of course it doesn't come, but I go and I talk to him, and he has this really cool, like sort of abstract, I guess it was a print of a drawing that he did of downtown with like the aquarium and the bridge and stuff. And I really liked it. It was like $20. I'm like, yeah, I'll send him a Venmo or whatever. Mm-hmm. And this whole process like took a few minutes, and cause I didn't have any cash on me, and then I had to download like the Cash App or something. It was it's like this whole thing. And then I finally go and I get in the car, and I'm like, well, that was whatever. Mm-hmm. Like, I need ice. I'm just going to go to Food City now. And I go to Food City, and I'm pulling up, and I start to ask myself, how many bags of ice am I going to get? Like, I start to have this thought in my head. Uh-huh. And before I even finish the thought, it's like 10. I need 10 bags of ice.
Yeah. Sounds logical.
Okay. I'm like, all right, 10 bags of ice. All right, fine.
Is this your first time doing the cold plunge in this thing? Okay.
Yeah. And I didn't know how many I would actually need for this thing. And so I go in.
That is expensive for ice.
Yeah.
Because ice is expensive now.
Yeah. I didn't keep the cold plunge. I actually got a chiller for it, and it worked really well, but then like at first, and then the chiller stopped working, and it was like, yeah. So I had like one day left to return it. And I'm like, no, I'm not dealing with this. So I go up, and I go to pay, and I tell them I need 10 bags of ice. Mm-hmm. And the cashier, and I pay, and he hands me the receipt, and I start to walk over to the ice cooler. As I'm walking up to the ice cooler, another employee comes from outside, like around the corner, walking up with a cart full of ice that he had gotten to fill up the ice cooler. Mm-hmm. And I was like,
I know where this is going.
Yeah, I was like, oh, hey, I was about to get some ice. Yeah. I need 10 bags. He's like, oh, I have exactly 10 bags right here in a cart ready for you. And it was one of those things where I'm like, this is so stupid and absurd that it got my attention of like, if any number of these little things in this whole process had been different, the timing would have been completely off. If I had picked a different bag or a different number of bags, like would that have happened? And there's no consequence to this, right?
No.
And this is why I think I was getting at in the episode of like, it's these little things where if you can like trust your intuition when like it's like little things like this, I think that what that does is it's like a small feedback loop that then just gets that habit and that practice. Mm-hmm. And you can look at the story and you can be like, you could run some sort of probability odds, but you can't, like, I look at it and I'm like, there's something about it that feels like something else was going on there. And I'm not ascribing like any, is that the right word? I don't know. I'm not assigning like any sort of like spiritual or anything like that piece to it, but because I actually think that I have like theories on mechanically how this could work in a
Of course,
in a certain universe structure. But I just thought it was really interesting, and it stuck with me. And I think that was the point, is that it was one of those things that it was weird and quirky and out of the ordinary that I will remember it forever. And so, but it's like just enough to where I'll remember it and I'll remember the lesson, but like not so much that it's like it has to be small in order for me to do it on a regular basis. You know what I mean? Like there's always huge stakes.
Yeah.
It feels like it's something that, you know, I wouldn't, it would be less likely.
You're not going to play around with the idea of it.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that was my very long story of like, and this is just like one example. So you asked me like patterns. This is what I mean. It's when I start playing around with this, you can sort of design tests for yourself and run those tests and just see what happens. If you just take the model and think about it, and just assume that it's true for a little while, and design some tests and see what happens. And if nothing happens, then great. But if you start noticing patterns, that's an interesting data point. And so it gives you threads to pull on to start experimenting and doing more. And in all of this, for me, it helps me uncover sort of my relationship with my environment in a way. It's like, what is the nature of my relationship with others and with my environment? In that, like, am I this sort of singular entity that is an island disconnected from everything else, or is there some connection there that is something that is not seen or known in a traditional sense? And can I explore that? And so that's how I like to think about these kind of things.
I think you're in a really great place to do shrooms.
You keep telling me that.
No, but like, because like every time I've ever heard of anybody like doing like heavy amounts of shrooms or acid, they always come back with this similar story of seeing like the hive mind and how we're all connected to each other, and they see that like invisible connection. I've always wanted to do like a heavier dose like in a controlled environment to see how that would be. But before I go too far, I want to ask, so are you ever afraid that, or is this ever a concern in your mind when seeing patterns that maybe you're just making it all up? Like this idea that like people see patterns where they want to see patterns. It's like how people make religions.
I mean, that's always my first thought. Like that's the sort of operating assumption. Like that's the hypothesis that I'm trying to that I'm trying to validate, actually. It's like, because it's much easier if I can tell myself, oh, I'm just making this up, then, because there's no implications for that. You know, it's just like, oh, this is fun, I'm making this up. You know, there's no like profoundness behind it that would cause me to have to shift something about my worldview, if that's what it is. And so that actually is the first thing that I look at. And so that's why I'm saying it's important to figure out a model that you can test, because if you can like falsify or unfalsify certain, like if you can make little predictions, run little tests, and then they end up actually working, then that gives you some evidence. I'm not saying it proves anything, but it gives you some evidence that, oh, maybe this isn't just me making stuff up. And like, I also think that there's I know there is a phenomenon around that, but I also question, like, when that usually comes from a place of like the universe is random, and so these patterns are just us like finding imaginary signal in the noise. But I think that's a pretty big assumption that randomness actually exists, and that we there aren't just larger patterns that we just don't have the ability to piece together with our cognitive capacity.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And like, cause if you look at like, what we call random, when we're talking about like randomly generating like a random number generator machine and stuff like that, all of that isn't actually random. Like when you look at like how functions are created in code to produce random things, you can't actually like there's always constraints. It's not truly random. And so like we assume that it's all chaos and it's all randomness. And I think part of that is like that doesn't call us to consider a higher order structure. And so I like to kind of hold both of those and not just let myself fall into the easy sort of cynical, it's all nonsense and I'm just making it up.
Yeah. I mean, I'm in a strong push right now to try to believe in reincarnation. And if that's the case, there's got to be some kind of higher system of existence. Not like, maybe not necessarily legitimately, but I'm exploring it the same way you explore different models and different things. I like the idea of it, and and the stories are very interesting to me. There's a great book I'm reading right now called Old Souls. It was written in the early 2000s before the internet was a thing, and in everyday life anyway. And so he actually wrote it in the 90s, and it's a whole book about this journalist who goes on this trip to India with this guy who studied reincarnation and was like the leading guy at it. For like 30 years and had all these collections of stories and stuff, and he had a very like scientific approach to it, and but it's like the more scientific he got, the more interesting the stories became, right? Like it's like, well, shit, now we can't disprove some of these things, like this doesn't make any sense, and it's really interesting, but so I had so many things that I was thinking when you were talking just now. Like
I went on for a while.
Yeah. What number am I thinking of right now? Intuitively.
4.
Holy shit. I've been thinking that number for so long. Oh my God. That's so good.
We're expecting that, were you?
Actually, I kind of was expecting it. That's the weird part, is this whole time I'm like, if I ask him what number I'm thinking, is he going to say 4? Like I was thinking it in my head. Yeah. And so like, that's so good. Oh my God.
So this is there's, I'm having trouble forming words because I keep like stopping myself. And I need to just like let it go of, I think the hesitation is that I don't want to be seen as someone who, I think that the way that I grew up in religion and, it's kind of termed magical thinking. Right.
Yeah.
And after deconstructing out of that, there was a stigma around this idea of magical thinking, and which the opposite side of that is just like materialist, reductionist view of the world, where only the grit is all that there is. And but that never really sat well with me. There was just there's something else there, and but it wasn't the frame through which I grew up in, but I always had this fear that people were going to see me as a magical thinker, which the way that has been used is in the past is someone who's just dumb and easily fooled, right? And so I think that's still those like kind of old stories that come in unconsciously when I start to venture into certain possibilities and talk through things that I don't have like a firm like concept or like model for that I can explain well, because then I'm like, they're just going to think that I have magical thinking because I can't explain the rigorous thought process behind it. Or like what's going on like internally. I can't put it into words well. And so I think that's always the hesitation in this. So I'm just going to like go through. I have this, and I know this is something that people talk about, and this is another thing too. It's like I don't mean it in like a generic way. There's like a specific sort of almost body sense of this, of like we're entering into a new paradigm as humanity.
Yeah.
And the woo-woo culture calls it like raising consciousness. And I think that like, I think there's something to that conceptually. But I think that I just get this sense that there's actually like a mechanistic, like like if you approach certain things scientifically, like you could figure out a mechanism for this in like a collective consciousness, sort of accessing like the next octave up, right? In this frequency that you're reverberating at, right? And in this, I'm just way more open to like quote unquote weird things than I have ever been in the past, like since I left religion, basically. Where if you look at like things like quote unquote predicting the future and psychic abilities and stuff like that was very closed off to before.
Yeah.
I feel like there's more and more like evidence that's coming into the collective consciousness and the mainstream that is opening up people to this idea. And I really, like, I suspect, I don't have any firm beliefs on this, but I suspect that it is a latent ability that we've have as a species that as we developed language has been like kind of almost gone dormant. Like we have it at a low level and we just have not learned to like access it again. And I say this because there are things like the telepathy tapes. Have you listened to that podcast at all?
No.
Or seen? So it's a study that was done with autistic kids who are nonverbal who can read people's minds. And
that's fun.
Yeah.
You said this is a podcast?
Yeah. There's I didn't listen to the podcast, but I watched a couple of interviews with the lady who did the podcast. Just like really good.
Followed.
And, yeah.
Subscribed.
And there's something about the being nonverbal that allows them to sort of access this realm. And they literally talk about like so many like from different places talk about going to meet on the hill, and they meet these other autistic nonverbal kids in a place somewhere that is not physical, because they have conversations and they hang out, and then they but they're physically separated. And then like
I've heard of this. This sounds familiar.
And then there are like these parents who like legit their kids are reading their minds and like can accurately do it 100% of the time. And they were afraid to say anything until this lady started like, publishing stuff about it. And then all of a sudden all these parents came out of the woodwork of like, oh my God, I've been experiencing this and I didn't want to say anything. And so it's a much more prevalent thing than I think that anyone realized. And let's assume that this is all legit and true for a moment. What are the implications of that? And like, what are some hypotheses around like what could be the mechanism for this? And like that's where my brain starts to go like, okay, this is what I mean when I say like, just believe it for a minute. Okay. Yeah. And put that aside. Does that give you, the ability then to start, formulating a model for how it might work? And then whether or not the model is right, at least it gives you a starting point for figuring out like, how could we test this? And my understanding, if you go and like look it up, I think when I tried to Steelman against it, it wasn't very good. But they quote unquote debunked it, but it wasn't at all debunked. Like, it was because basically the way they do this all the time when it's something that it contradicts the current sort of paradigm. They say, oh, we need much more data in a very controlled, specific setting in order for us to have any kind of like consider there's any kind of strong evidence. And they're like, well, we want to do this, but there are complications because these autistic kids are very sensitive, and like you have to do it in a very specific way, and we got to get funding for it. And it's like, who's going to fund it? And it's like, there's all this stuff.
Yeah.
Rather than saying, okay, actually, this is a really strong signal. Let's use that signal to actually explore it. It's like, oh, we're going to dismiss the signal because we don't have the evidence in the way that we say we need it, but we're not going to help kind of get that evidence, right? It's an easy way to dismiss it, and that's how so many things get done. But that's an example of
that's how autism itself was dismissed
right.
decades ago,
right?
Yeah. And when I was a kid, that wasn't even a diagnosis you could have. I guess it's not a diagnosis now, again, in America at least. But yeah, it wasn't even a diagnosis. So my brother never got it, and he should have been diagnosed.
So it's interesting too, like what actually then is autism, and and are they actually operating in a higher level of consciousness that we can't really understand, and so to us it looks like they're not functioning very well, but they're actually just functioning on a much higher level, and we don't see it, and so like those are the kinds of questions that I'm really interested in. So that's one. And then like, dude, so this is like really, really out there. I for a while have been, because I've been obsessed with conspiracy theories, and there's one guy that I've just been fascinated with for a long time, and so I've been following him just because I want to. He doesn't have like, I'd say he probably has like a 60% hit rate maybe on the stuff that he says.
Okay.
But that's not why I'm following. Like when you understand his process, that actually makes sense. But he always like he's so far out there in the way that he thinks that he's always like getting me to think about certain things differently, just like a different approach. I'm like, I would never have considered that. Like, let's play with that idea for a minute, right?
Yeah.
So his name is Cliff High, and his story is basically he's a psychonaut.
What's a psychonaut?
A psychonaut is an explorer of
like cosmonaut
of the hyperverse, where you go when you take shrooms and different substances like that, is what he calls it.
Okay, I love that.
And so he was a software engineer. Worked for like IBM and Microsoft back in the 70s and 80s, and government contractor. He grew up his dad was in the military, so he grew up like traveling all over the world, different military bases and stuff. Anyway, he did that, and he's also actually died 3 or 4 times, and so has had near-death experiences and has come back, and but what he wanted to do to test whether or not this realm was real was like, could I go to this realm and learn something, like bring something back that then I could actually use in the real world? And so he did that, and what he brought back was an algorithm, and the idea behind it is the hypothesis behind it is that we actually all have latent psi abilities, and that we don't even realize it, that as major events are kind of like starting to materialize in the time stream ahead of us, it shows up in our collective language as markers. And so he brought back an algorithm that could start like making sense of those markers to make predictions. And so he predicted 9/11, he predicted COVID, he predicted like Bitcoin and like all this stuff, but the way that it shows up is like in specific language that it's hard to know exactly what, especially the farther out it goes, it's hard to know exactly what it's going to be until it shows up and it's like, oh, that's what this language meant. Like COVID was like sun disease that kept showing up, and it was around all these other different markers, and it's like, oh, coronavirus. but it like fits it within the certain time frame that it sounds crazy, but the way like, and it's definitely not an exact science by any means. But I've listened to him because I want to like listen to what he has to say and hear what he's predicting to see like what actually happens.
Yeah.
And there've been some things where I'm like, dude, he was spot on with that.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that just like shook me was the assassination attempt on Trump. Like 3 months before.
Mm-hmm.
He gave almost to like, I think it was like the exact date. It may have been a day off. There's always like a window in there.
Yeah.
But because he didn't say specifically what was going to happen, but he was like, this event is going to occur. And here's all the language that's showing up that's describing it. Here's my hypothesis about what it is.
This is like language everybody says online, or like how is he gathering this information?
Yeah.
Okay.
So he wrote these web bots that would scrape the internet, and it's a lot harder to do now because of how much they censor it.
Yeah.
But that's he's basically just massive data, and runs it through all these algorithms, and like he was spot on. And so there was him, and then there was another video that showed up, and it was on YouTube like a few months before as well, where this was like a religious one, like a charismatic Pentecostal type guy who had a dream or a vision and very clearly said that Trump was shot in the ear and like described the scene, and it was like 90% all that, and this was like a few months beforehand. And I'm like, what the like I that stuff just it messes with my head because I'm like, what do I do with that?
Yeah.
You know? And then if you start to open up, you realize that there's actually a lot of evidence for this kind of stuff. And there's a guy that some of the stuff that I was like the language that I was using in this episode came from an interview I watched with the guy. I think he wrote a book. I think it's called Time Loops. That's where he was talking about like temporal non-locality and retrocausality, and I don't remember if there's a lot of stuff where I've like learned a lot of different things and I kind of piece them together. I don't remember exactly where everything came from, but the kind of working hypothesis is, from what my understanding is like there are these microtubules in our brains, and it's a specific structure. I think if I remember correctly, like they encase the neurons or something like that. But the way that they're structured actually acts like a quantum computer. So it's like we have a sort of traditional computer. It's like our brain is like a mixture of a traditional computer and a quantum computer. And the way that a quantum computer works is it works in superposition. So like a traditional computer, it's all binary, ones and zeros, but a superposition is it's basically 1 or 0 or not 1 or not 0, and it's like it's hard to explain. But it's like it's in like different, like multiple states at once. And
there's a whole show based on this.
Okay, good.
It's called Dark Matter.
I haven't watched. I watched like the first episode.
So good. Anyway.
And so the kind of working hypothesis with that is that that it works through like quantum tunneling and spatial non-locality, because that's how quantum entanglement works, right? And
it's a lot of big words.
Yeah, I know. It's so I can't go through and explain how quantum entanglement works right now. But essentially, like the idea then is like, because space time is sort of one thing, that if something is spatially non-local, it would, and which they, so I think it was the if I remember correctly, like the Nobel Prize in 2022 was for like proving like non-locally that the reality, like base reality, is non-local, and so like if space is spatially non-local, then it could also be temporally non-local, which means that quantum computers are actually accessing time outside of like the present time, and while they're doing these computations, and that's how they do it.
Whoa! Oh, I've heard this. Yes,
I've
heard this.
Right?
That theory. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a theory on how quantum computers work. But if these microtubules in our brains act as a type of quantum computer, then that gives us the ability to then also access outside of the present time. All right. So that's what it means by temporally non-local. And so it's fascinating to me because if there's something to this, then it just changes everything. Yeah. And so then I wonder, like, how long have we known that this was a thing? And is there a stigma around it because it actually is real? Like, if you look at, if you go back to, so like remote viewing, this is something I think you and I have talked about that you were like highly skeptical of. I don't remember. So remote viewing is the idea that you can sit down and basically access information non-locally, spatially, and temporally. Okay. So you can sit down a remote view, and you have, it has to be double blind, and you're given a target. You don't know anything about it, and you go through this process. If it's done right, you go through this process that then allows you to observe and write down what you observe. And then they test it and see like how accurate it is. And there's some people that have a very, very high, like 90+% accuracy rate. And this is something that was really pioneered. I think they did a lot in Russia during the Cold War, but here in the States, it was at the Stanford Research Institute with like Hal Puthoff and I'm blanking on the other guy's name at the moment. Russell Targ maybe. And then there were Joe McMoneagle and Uri Geller and some other guys are kind of like the original remote viewers. And this was all funded by like the DOD and stuff for many, many years. Yeah. And was used to like operationally to like Joe McMoneagle actually won like this Medal of Valor or something for it. But then they shut it down, quote unquote, because they couldn't get any real results from it. But I think that like they just moved the program because as people found out about it, they moved the program into dark and said that it was nothing to it because there's actually something to it. Right. And so there's this idea then that, okay, let's extrapolate this out a little bit where, let's assume that this is true. What does that actually mean? It means that there's no such thing as secrets. Right. Yeah. Right. Which means that if we can develop abilities that then allow us to experience truth for ourselves, then like there's no controlling us, from a governmental structure. Sure. Right. Yeah. And so there are huge implications for that. Right. So that's one thing. Number two is, let's assume that we can. Where was I going with number two? Damn it! It had something to do with the telepathy tapes, and I don't remember.
Sorry, listener. This is unedited.
Let's be honest. No one's listening at this point.
Yeah, that's probably true.
But so basically, like, what are the implications of this? Like, it fundamentally changes. Oh, the other thing that I remember now. So some of the people that were in these telepathy tapes, they could just like learn languages instantly. Like one of the girls learned Egyptian hieroglyphics from an ancient Egyptian priest that she met in this realm. Like just instantly, and came back and knew how to do all this stuff. And if this is real, like if this is true, and this would also explain like how like certain savants just have the ability to play like Mozart, or just like do crazy math in their heads, and like all of a sudden, right? It might explain some of that where it's like you're not accessing something that's like your brain's not generating it. You're accessing something that is like a collective consciousness level thing where you can just kind of download it like the Matrix, right? Yeah. And if that's true, then that just like it gets rid of like we're no longer in the age of authority. Like there is no authority outside of myself because I can access truth for myself. Sure. I can learn anything I want, right? And I can become like this self-sovereign person. And that's, that is a completely different humanity. At that
Very
point.
attractive to a 5.4,
Right, right, exactly.
though. You have a disdain for authority as a 5.4.
Very much so, yeah.
Yeah, there was a guy when I was a teenager and was definitely in the Christian music scene at the time, was signed to a Christian label, and and through the label I met this guy who was like super involved in Christian things, but I think it was interesting because I think he had stumbled onto ideas and concepts that were way beyond the idea of God, but he just attributed them to God. So I wrote it off. But like the older I get and the more I hear about things, the more I think back to some of the conversations. He was at the time, I mean, I was probably 18 or 19. So like, we're talking 20 years ago. He was like 60 something. I think he died in like 2015. But his name was David Vancouvering. I don't know if I've ever talked to him about him on the show before, but he was kind of a wild guy. When I met him, he invited us over to his house and took me into a room that was just filled. I'm talking like twice the size of this room, like massive room, just filled floor to ceiling of records and tapes and CDs and all these things. And he said, I invented a sound that's on it's one track at least of all of these albums throughout history. And it went back all the way because he is one of the original inventors of the synth. He met a guy named Bob Moog and helped Bob Moog develop the Moog synthesizer, which is one of the most world-renowned like original synths. Yeah. And so he's also the one who invented the compact disc, the original patent for it.
Wow.
And he did it for the government when they were afraid of like Cold War and stuff, and they were putting information on big discs to put in submarines under the water, right? Yeah. But that same concept, that same patent was later designed into the idea of a CD, a compact disc. But he developed all these different things. He was very good with theremins and things like that, like spatial things. But there was this time where he also had died multiple times. And one time he died, and he was dead for multiple minutes. And when he was there, it was a place he was in a different place. He said it felt like almost like he was in just like a mist, and he could hear all of these sounds, and he was very conscious of what was happening, and he could hear all these sounds that he'd never heard before. And when he came back too, he was like, I have to know what those sounds are. Like, this was music made on a plane that he had never heard before, that didn't go by our understanding of music is like the 12 notes and like the math of music, right? Yeah. And so he tried to design it. I wish I could remember what it was called, but he ended up designing it based on the idea of the table of elements. And he was able to create an instrument that played the sounds that he heard. And I think it was, what's Victor Wooten's brother's name? I can't remember. The drummer, he bought it. And so he has that instrument. So he has the prototype of it. And so, but there's all these people and all these things that he's kind of like had his hands in at different times through the idea. And it was like a lot of his career was around music, but he's a scientist. He had done different, he tried to do like I remember he'd say something about a experiment that they did where they tried to purify water with different environments without using any purification process. Or if like they take water that's already clean and it would degrade in certain environments while purifying itself in other environments. And like different things. Like he's done all different kinds of stuff, and I think a lot of stuff he was like you said, 60% of the time, right? Like you're off on some things, as anybody would be. You can't follow every thread, but yeah, it's just interesting. It's odd. It talks about that different plane of consciousness in that way too, that kind of accesses different parts of who we are. I've wondered too if it's like the more familiar you are with the person, the easier it is, or you just don't realize it. In terms of like reading other people's minds. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Like, oh my God. I really think that Amy is a psychic. Like she can read my mind. Like the very first time I said I love you to her was in my head. And she heard me.
Oh, wow.
Like, and we were dating like a week,
Yeah.
and we were making out, and we
You
stopped.
said I love you in your head after a week?
Dude, yeah. Like, I mean, I opened up a savings account for an engagement ring the day before our first date. So, yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I forgot about that.
And
It's so funny.
and like I looked at her, and in my head I said it just like intuitively without before I realized it. And then her face, as soon as I said it, like I could tell she heard me. And then I like freaked out. I'm like, what? And then so I'm like, well, she heard me. I guess I have to say it out loud. So then I said it out loud. And then it was like the longest pause I think of my entire life. And then she said it back.
Oh, wow.
But she hears me all of the time. It's weird. There's just all kinds of little things like that where it's like, I cannot conventionally explain some of the stuff that she picks up. And then like stuff will happen with me too, where this has happened multiple times where I am pulling up to the house, like I'm a block away, and I'll get a song in my head, and I'll start like singing or humming the song, and I will walk into the house, and it is the song that Amy and the kids are playing on like a Spotify playlist or something, where it's like physically there's no way I could have heard the song
Right.
when I started humming it. It's like I psychically or intuitively knew that this was the song that was going to play. It's weird.
I've definitely been experiencing that a lot more with Madison lately, where we say the same things and think the same things all the time. Today we were at a soccer game before this, and we were leaving, and it's like sometimes I just hear things and I think some of it's just predictive, right? Like I knew what she was going to do and I did it. Like somebody was like, free pizza over here, anybody who wants it? And I just looked at her. She wasn't looking at me, she was looking ahead, but I looked directly at her, and we both at the exact same time said, free pizza. And then she looked at me and started laughing. I was like, I already knew you were going to say it. I was like right there. It was like a movie moment. But then the weirdest one was last night. We're sitting on the couch, hadn't spoken in a while. We were watching a TV show, and I just look over at her and I said, you know what I really want right now? And she went, a banana split from Baskin Robbins. And I was like, yes. And she was like, it's almost like I can hear you thinking it. And it was so weird. I was like that because we haven't had a banana split from Baskin Robbins in forever. Like what in the world?
This is what I'm saying. Like, okay, we can laugh about this, and this is a funny thing, but if we just like, let's believe it for a minute, what experiments could we run? You know what I mean? Like, let's just see. Let's develop some hypotheses and actually run some experiments and see like, can we accurately predict whether or not this will happen and whether we can hear each other. And I'm just curious to see what we find.
Yeah. All right.
What number am I thinking of?
Well, I was going to ask you that question. So if it's the same number, it would be really weird because the word I'm thinking of is 10.
Oh my God. Are you serious?
No.
I am not messing with you right now. That is the number that it was. What the fuck?
All right, it's time to go to bed. We got to get out of here. That's so crazy.
Oh my God.
I've been thinking it for so long.
Oh my God.
See, it's so weird when it happens. Right after you said 4, I had 10 in my head. And I was like, I'm going to wait till the end and I'm going to ask you. Did you ask me? Oh my God. That's so weird. Well, that means it's true because now we did it twice in a row.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.